have experienced that. Okay, so they're coming in. Okay, not in your current environment, in your previous one. Okay, some people are sending it direct to me, not to everyone. I understand. Okay, so evidently, as we can see, we've all operated in toxic environments. Now, why did I choose this topic for this course? Because really, I believe this is the elephant in the room that we don't talk about enough. We can talk a lot about internal audit methodologies, and the way we execute internal audit, or the way we assess our fraud environment, the way we assess our culture. But if we don't talk about the elephant in the room regarding toxicity, we will get nowhere. All of you work in audit environments, and you understand how difficult it is when you're trying to work and you're dealing with people who have toxic traits. And that's why I chose this presentation. So I'm going to be talking about 70 areas. I'm going to be talking about what are traits of toxic leaders. And toxic leaders are like bullies. And the best way to face a bully is to call them out. Toxic leaders need to be called out. So what are their traits? What are symptoms of toxic leadership? What are the traits of a toxic organization? Some people may ask me, well, if I am auditing in a toxic organization, what do I do? I will answer that in a bit. What's the correlation between toxicity and fraud? Are there statistics? I did some research regarding if there are statistics about toxicity and fraud. Is it more likely a toxic environment will lead into fraud? Another question is, why do we hire toxic people? Another question to ask, which I will answer in this course, is why do we sometimes like toxic people? So these are key topics that I want to talk about. It's about time we put a spotlight on this, because this harms not only the organization, not only its shareholders, but the mental health of the employees, of all other related parties involved in this process. So I want to show you some examples of toxic leaders. Unfortunately, I tried to find examples in Lebanon. I couldn't find any. So I'm going to be only using examples of toxic leaders outside Lebanon. Because Lebanon, I looked from the government to the private companies, and not enough examples were there. So these are examples of toxic leaders who were eventually charged with fraud in their organizations. Now, the thing is, the people that you see here in front of you were once very highly respected people. They chaired boards. They were CEOs. They sat on management committees. They had people like you and me admiring them. They had people like you and me looking up to them. You had people like you and me believing in them. They had people trust. They had people give them their money. And they ended up to be a big fraud. Let us talk about a few examples here. And I want you in your mind to correlate this with maybe any examples that you know in your life. So I will start by talking about Bernie Madoff, because now recently on Netflix, there's a documentary on Bernie and what happened at Madoff, a $60 billion Ponzi scheme. One of the interesting things about Madoff is that it lasted for such a long period of time. But another interesting thing is that the extent to which people trusted him. And he used to say in his interviews when he was in prison, he used to say that I reached a point in time where I was under pressure to give more profit because people were actually demanding that from me. So his customers were demanding more profits from him. And this raises a question on why do we trust toxic leadership? Is it trust, or is it just greed justified by trust? But this guy here, what did he do with auditors? just to let you know how he played it around. So when the auditors came to audit Bernie, every time they were looking in the wrong areas, he would praise them. He would tell them, you're doing a great job. And every time they were getting close to the areas in which he had monkey business, he would bully them. And then they would go away, they would run away. He used his charisma, he used his power, he used his authority. He used the impression he created around himself to justify the fraud. And he had a lot of people trust in him. But the question is, why would we give money to people like this? Let's go to Sam, FTX, 2 months ago, it collapsed $34 billion. This is a 29-year-old guy who was living in a villa with 10 other people. His girlfriend was heading the trading arm of another company that was doing business with FTX. And the question is, what I cannot understand is this guy was admired. He was seen as a genius. People loved him because he was different. And he was actually managing people. How? Type. Elizabeth Holmes, the lady that you see here, she created a company called Theranos. And this company claimed to create a blood testing tool that can have you test blood at home and give you results. And it was all a sham. Her board of directors included very reputable, well-known businessmen across the US. She was seen as a hero in her field. She used to go and do presentations and stand up in conferences. By the way, she also received many, many awards for being such an exceptional genius. And she turned out to be also a big fraud. And she was sentenced now recently to, I think, 5 or 7 years in jail. Okay, we have the guy that you see with the word Wirecard behind him. This guy is called Marcus Brum. If you have been following me, you know how passionate I am about the Wirecard story, because it includes all the possible stupidity that you could see in a board or you could see in an executive manager. It has all the possible level of stupidity that you can see coming from a regulator, actually. And excuse me for being outspoken, but I believe we have to start maybe talking in this language because no one is really listening. So this company, Wirecard, this is a publicly listed company. It was considered one of the top 30 companies in Germany. And they created more than $2 billion in fake sales. They were audited financially by one of the big four. I'm not going to name it now, so no one takes it personal. They were audited for 8 years by one of the big four, giving a clean opinion on their financials. They claimed to have $2 billion in cash, which they did not have. No one bothered by actually validating if customers really existed. No one bothered by looking into the cash. But this story, what makes it astonishingly weird, is that for 6 years, a reporter in the Financial Times by the name of Makram, he spent around 6 years writing articles in the Financial Times proving that this company is a fraud. And no one listened to the guy. They kept on giving this company money. And this guy that you see in front of you, he used to go wear a black turtleneck, stand up in conferences, CNBC do interviews with him. People call him a genius, and he turned into a fraud. And guess what? This guy used to also chair boards. He used to chair committees. He used to attend conferences. He used to walk around with secretaries following. And he turned out to be a big fraud. I don't want to talk about the other examples. We don't have much time. But the point of this slide is to show you that toxic leaders, they exist among us all the time. We need to learn and understand what are their traits so they can be called out. And so we don't confuse these traits with something more admirable, because many of us sometimes work with toxic leaders and convince ourselves that these are good traits that we need to actually admire and respect. So some traits of toxic leaders: narcissism, a sense of self-importance and lack of empathy for others. Leaders who show no recognition for others, for their feelings, for their emotions, people that they work with. Authoritarianism, a desire for complete control. You find them, if you are an auditor and you worked with a toxic leader with authoritarian characteristics, you would realize they would smash the controls all across the wall, and they would use their power with the board to make you look like you are not competent or professional enough to do your job. These are the types of characteristics that they have. Manipulation, using deceitful tactics, divide and conquer, having people work against themselves. They are usually very insecure, by the way, but they hide that insecurity with bulliness. So they have a need to constantly prove oneself or undermine the accomplishment of others. How many times do you know people who have done something so good and then they go to someone and they tell them, this is trash. This is a trait. Lack of accountability, of course. They don't take a responsibility for anything. So for example, when they do something wrong, it's usually everyone's fault. You will see this in toxic leaders. When a decision they take goes wrong, it's everyone's fault. However, when something goes right, they go and get an award for it. Okay? So this is a key characteristic that you need to also take into consideration. Intolerance. They don't have patience for ideas, beliefs, or the perspectives of others. Usually they don't listen, by the way. So you talk, and then when they respond based on the last comment they said to you before you started talking. They're very aggressive. They're self-centered, center of attention. The world revolves around them. Of course, they lack integrity, but sometimes it's hidden well. Sometimes it's hidden well of the image that they put through. And of course, arrogance, an attitude of superiority. These are traits of toxic leaders. However, toxic leaders, and many of you may disagree with me here, they have enablers. There are a lot of people in the organization that enable toxic leadership, and outside the organization as well. It could be you or me, by the way. They don't exist without an environment that supports them. So let's look if they are enabled or not. I am not saying that every type of entity here is an enabler, but it's a possible enabler. So I put the toxic leader in the middle. Of course, I put a female and a male, because sometimes we have toxic female leaders, we have toxic male leaders. And the enablers, I will start with internal auditors. A question you will ask yourselves: is it possible that internal auditors may enable a toxic leader? If you ask me, of course they can. Bad auditors exist just like good auditors exist. And bad auditors can enable. Actually, bad auditors will survive off the characteristics of toxic leaders. We have to be very careful. How about the audit committee? Of course, audit committees enable toxic leaders if they fail to address the right concerns at the right time. So once I had a video that I published on why audit committees fail. And I always say audit committees are not mailboxes. As an audit committee, you're not a mailbox that receives information and sends it to a board. You have a duty to play, an oversight duty. You have a role to play in questioning, in challenging both the auditor and management sometimes. Of course, now people will be thinking, why am I speaking in this way? Not all companies are like that. Of course, we are talking about the minority of companies. There are very good companies out there. There are excellent audit committees and excellent auditors, but we have to talk about the minority. What about regulators? Do regulators enable toxic leaders? Of course they do. When they turn the other way, they are enabling a toxic leader. Just like what happened in Wirecard. The regulator, they audited them every year. They were aware there were discrepancies and they looked the other way. That's enablement. You have to understand something, that when toxic leaders get away with it, they further enable themselves in the organization. Just like what happened to Madoff. So Madoff, when the SEC came they did an audit and they didn't find anything. When they left, he started using that as an excuse to take more people's money by saying, well, look, the SEC came and they found nothing. External auditors, definitely they can. How about the human resource department? Anyways, toxic leaders will only hire a head of HR that is playing their game. What about chairman of the board? Of course, if the chairman of the board is sleeping at the wheel, toxic leaders will further go on in what they do. And customers, of course they do. As Madoff said, he said, my customers were putting me under pressure to make them more money. I was under pressure, so I started making them more money. So that's the role of an enablement. Now, I'm not saying, again, that all of these stakeholders are real enablers in life. However, they play a role. Toxic leaders don't fall from the sky. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. But at the same time, they need an environment to harbor them. And that's what we have seen across the board in many countries, except Lebanon, of course, but I'm talking about all the other countries. So what are symptoms of toxic leadership? We talked about lack of empathy, constant criticism, negative feedback, inability to take responsibility for poor performance. It's always someone else's fault, unwillingness to listen or consider the opinion of others, use of fear, intimidation to control, lack of transparency, favoritism. You will find there are a few people that, they might be unqualified and suddenly you see them in high positions. I'm sure I've seen that, you've seen that, we've all seen that, we've seen that on TV. We have seen cases where unqualified people go to high places. You will look around, you will find a toxic leader flying around somewhere. So, focusing more on profits than people, resistance to change, all of these are. So what are symptoms of a toxic leader? Sorry, this is the wrong slide here. Okay, so traits of a toxic organization. Now we're not talking about the individual, we want to talk about the company itself. If I was you and I go into an organization and it has toxic traits, run away, don't go. Even if it had a good name, even if it offered a good salary, don't go. Just don't, because you're going to put a lot of effort into that organization and it will end up in a disaster. So what are key traits of organizations that have toxicity? And for auditors who one day will audit culture, because as you know, in the IIA, we have a publication on auditing culture, and you will be auditing culture at one point in time. So you need to be aware of what are toxic traits in organization. So first, lack of clear direction and goals, a lack of vision, purpose for the organization, confusion, low morale among employees. There's an informal grapevine. People, a lot of politics in the company. Poor communication, a lack of transparency and open dialogue among management and employees. High turnover rates. People don't stay. Lack of trust, a lack of faith in leadership and colleagues, which can lead to the lack of collaboration more. And unhealthy competition, a cutthroat environment where employees are pitted against each other, divide and conquer. You want to please the boss, you go tell him, look what this guy did, look what this guy said. That's a toxic trait. Inadequate resources, a lack of funding, tools, or support necessary to perform job duties. Discrimination, harassment, no opportunities for growth, unfairness. People get to the top, you don't understand why and how. No work-life balance. You are expected to stay in the office till 7, although you don't have any work. Why? Because the boss stays at work till 7. Or many people pretend to be working and they get these huge bonuses and they're doing nothing. That's another trait. Resistance to change, a lack of adaptability and innovation, because They're afraid of change. Change might spot out their toxicity. It might spot out what they do. Okay, so what's the relationship between toxic leaders and fraud? Are all toxic leaders fraudulent? No. The statistics does not say there's always a correlation. However, does the statistics show that toxic leaders are more likely to commit fraud than others? Then yes, that is correct. Now, there is a potential link between toxic leadership and fraud, and that a toxic leader may create an environment where fraud is more likely to occur. So what we need to understand that in toxic leadership, and that's what boards need to do, that's the responsibility of the board of directors, to understand if there is toxicity in the organization. Because toxic environments, they hate controls. They don't like controls. Because controls impede their ability to achieve anything of their own objectives. And therefore, toxicity creates the environment that enables fraud. Toxic leaders may create a culture of fear and intimidation, which can discourage employees from speaking out. They may also create favoritism, where certain employees are provided with preferential treatment, which can lead to unequal distribution of resources in the organization. Toxic leaders may exhibit the lack of integrity, and the lack of integrity results in fraud. Toxic leaders may create conditions that make fraud more likely to occur. So, why do boards hire toxic leaders? Again, toxic leaders are many times admired by their boards. It's because what? Some boards may do favor short-term financial goals, because the aggressiveness of toxic people may get good results in the short run, usually collapsing the company in the long run. They may also see a toxic executive as someone who can quickly turn around a company. So they would say, you know what, we need someone like this to do change and change the culture and create the mood that we need. But many times that always ends in a bad way. They may be perceived as strong leaders, by the way. And be careful. Here we go in a rationalization process. Each person based on their own needs and desires. So for example, if you see this person, when they succeed, it will benefit you, you will justify their toxic traits. Now, the worst thing that can happen, if the auditor or the compliance or the risk management, they see a toxic leader as correlated with their success. And then they begin to rationalize that in their monitoring processes. This becomes very delicate. Additionally, toxic executives, they may be able to present a charismatic and polished image. Look at the pictures I saw you at the beginning. All of these, they wear ties, suits, they're very nice. If you sit and talk with them, you will say, wow, I wish I can be on their team. I wish I can be like them. No toxic leader is going to tell you I am a criminal. They act as if they are humanitarian. They want to do good. They want the best for everyone. They're polished. But it doesn't mean they're not toxic. So boards sometimes lack the knowledge or experience to recognize the warning signs of toxic leadership. And this is why I was saying that ultimately the responsibility falls on the board. There are signs. The board needs to be aware of them. At the end of the presentation, I will talk about the role of the different board committees as it relates to minimizing toxicity. I would say minimizing because toxicity varies. There's no such thing as no toxicity at all in a company or as 100% toxic. There's a variation there. However, the board can play a role to limit to a large extent all the different types of enablers that will create and harness an environment that can actually I would say, encourage people to act in a toxic way. Now, again, toxic leaders don't fall from the sky. I forgot to mention that. You know, they are hired in the company. We're going to talk about the hiring process, because not only toxic CEOs are hired, toxic managers are hired sometimes. Sometimes you hire a manager who knows nothing about their job. And when they go into a company, when a toxic manager is hired in a company and they know nothing about their job, their only way of survival is playing politics in the company. God forbid we have an auditor like that. That would be a catastrophic event for for a company. However, any head of department who doesn't know what they're doing will play politics as a means of survival, and that could be detrimental for the organization. Now, some statistics. Now, according to a study that was conducted by HBR, the Harvard Business Reviews, toxic leaders are found in 1 out of every 5 organizations. Okay. Of course, the study did not include Lebanon. If it did, then the sample would have been bigger. Than it would be 1 out of 10 organizations. But however, so every 1 of 5 organizations had a toxic leader. The study found that toxic leaders have a negative impact on employee engagement, productivity, turnover. And let's see this part of the statistic. It says an organization loses $12,000 per employee due to toxic leadership. This is a statistic based on the HBR. So although you might think you are profiting from having an aggressive toxic leader, eventually there's a big loss that is being recorded. Now, another study by the Center of Creative Leadership found that toxic leaders are responsible for 58% of all leadership failures. The study also found that toxic leaders are 3 times more likely to be promoted than non-toxic leaders. And that's alarming. And the reason why they get promoted more, because the means that they use within their toxicity, sometimes, or even more than sometimes, it falls on the right ears. So they are, and this is why, how sad is it? And how many times we have seen it in so many organizations. You find this very strong guy knowing what to do, being completely pushed aside by someone who knows nothing about what they're doing. However, they know how to play the right keys in the organization. And this is validating this study. This study was not done by me. It was done by another organization. A survey by the Society for Human Resource Management found that nearly half of all employees have experienced or witnessed toxic behavior, just like you guys have in the workplace. The survey also found that toxic behavior can have a significant impact on employee engagement. Only 21% of employees who have experienced toxic behavior reporting that they are highly engaged in their work. A study by the American Psychological Association found that toxic leaders can lead to increased stress and burnout among employees, and can also lead to higher risk of depression, anxiety, and mental health issues. Because toxic leaders win by breaking people. And this is something that falls on the responsibility of every board. Because the welfare of the mental health of your employees falls on the table of the board. Now, a study published in the Journal of Business Ethics found that toxic leadership is positively correlated with unethical behavior in the workplace, including fraud. In the occupational survey that is published by the ACFE, they talk a lot about the tone at the top and the influence of the tone on fraud. In the Journal of Financial Crime, toxic leadership is positively correlated with financial crime, and that includes money laundering, insider trading, conflicts of interest, bribery, God forbid. A study published in the Journal of Business Ethics found that toxic leaders may create a culture in which unethical behavior, including fraud, look at this, it's very interesting, is tolerated and even encouraged. So what they're saying here, and this is the sad truth, what they're saying is when toxic leadership is normalized in the organization, employees no longer see fraudulent acts as fraud. It is normalized. It becomes acceptable. Be careful. And it can reach in the culture to a large extent where people now hate the person who comes and say, look, guys, this is fraud. They will kick him out. What are you saying? You're crazy, right? So this is what they're saying in this statistic. They're saying that toxic leaders make it a culture in which unethical behavior, including fraud, is tolerated or even encouraged. This, by the way, can also apply to countries. Huh? So it can apply to countries, it can apply to societies, it can apply to cultures all over the world, of course. So I have 10 more minutes. How do we combat toxicity? This is the name of the game at the end of the day. Now, for sure, to give you it, من الآخر. Look, you live one life.
As internal auditor, how do we fight? How we combat toxicity?
What do you want? Do you want it as an auditor? I'll give it to you.
No, I'm asking.
What do you want? Tell me.
Being a colleague, let's say, for this toxic leader.
Yeah. So look, of course, I'm going to talk about the roles and responsibilities of the different stakeholders in the organization to combat toxicity. However, the first thing, but I can tell you, at the end of the day, if you are entering an organization that is heavily intoxicated, okay, it's not worth it. And now this is personal advice. This is no longer, I'm talking about professional. You have one life to live. Yeah. You don't need actually to go through that. However, we're talking about the moderate levels of toxicity now. The first way to combat toxicity is through applying proper governance. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm not talking here about design governance. You know, I know a country where many institutions had great governance that looked very good, right? But at the end proved to be all existing in form rather than substance. Okay, so now I'm talking about governance that is designed in the right way. And by design in the right way, it means that if you apply good criteria for selecting independent board members, if you have proper conflict of interest policies that are really implemented, okay, if you choose board members that are qualified and truly independent, if you have real succession planning procedures, if you have a right code of ethics that actually works, if you have a whistleblowing system that is actually reliable, people can actually rely on, they will know, they trust that their identity will not be portrayed. If you have a good org structure that ensures segregation of duty, that ensures that there's no segregation of power, that makes sure that I have proper monitoring functions doing their jobs in the right way, that I have an auditor that was selected in the right way and is empowered, and. If you have the right reports presented to the board, if you have, I'm going to talk about the committees in a bit, if you have proper transparency and disclosures, you have real KPIs that reflect the real performance of the organization, not representing a performance that is misleading. I also know and have seen across the world many organizations that were, hi, Madoff. Madoff was profitable for years. 25 years, Madoff was giving a return of 12 to 13%. It was all misleading performance. Wirecard was showing profitability every year, stock price increasing until they became one of the top 30 publicly listed companies. And it was all BS. Okay, so these are all dynamics that need to be taken into consideration. How do we measure performance? There should be proper mechanisms at the board level to say what is real performance. You want to fight toxicity more at the board level, and if you as an auditor, you can recommend it to them. How do you assess the performance of management? How do you assess the performance of the board members? How do you assess the performance of the audit committees? However, if your entire system is based on a selection of incompetent people, so you can have a certain result, that all doesn't make sense. That all doesn't have any meaning. So fighting toxicity is about creating an environment of sound governance systems that are adequately designed and implemented. Not just designed, but also implemented. So people can be held accountable for performance that is measured in an appropriate way, whereby I have good systems for speaking up, for investigating whistleblowing accusations, for making sure succession planning exists, and so on. Now, how do we get all of this in place? How do we do all of that? How do we do all of these governance elements? Well, look, now there's a responsibility on the board committees that are, and these are some of the board committees that have a major responsibility when it comes to toxicity and when it comes to culture. In many of the organizations that we have seen, whereby the organizations collapsed due to fraudulent leadership, you will see the board of directors saying it's not me, or bring the auditor, let us put him on some or get the risk guy or get the compliance guy and so on. However, board committees have a role to play. Nomination and remuneration committee. This committee first, it nominates the leadership team, it nominates board directors. This committee is responsible for ensuring that the right people are hired for the job. It is responsible for ensuring that the directors at the board level are competent, qualified, and independent, truly independent, not selected by someone that is close to the organization, but they are truly independent. If this committee, and by the way, in my opinion, this is the least functioning committee. No one wants this committee to work. I don't know why. It doesn't work. They don't like it to nominate. Or remuneration. Setting the proper remuneration systems. By the way, there's a statistic that directly correlates the nature of remuneration with fraud in the organization, by the way. The way you design your remuneration systems in the company can incentivize fraud, or it can result in minimizing the possibilities of fraud. So where is this committee? Where are those board members? Are they qualified to play this role? Are they there? This is where the problem is. Now, you want the role of the audit? The role of the audit is to tell them that. In a very nice way, of course. Don't hurt their feelings. Risk management committee. Conduct risk. So we see institutions focusing on the typical risks. Okay, that's very important. But I want to remind everyone that as part of operational risks, I have two categories that I don't know why they are overstepped many times. Internal fraud and external fraud. There are two categories of operational risks. What are we doing about that? Do we have a section regarding fraud risks in the committee, at the risk committee? And if we do, is anyone really reading it? And if they are reading it, are they taking any action on it? Right. Compliance committee. Let's talk about conduct. The compliance committee of the board has a key role to play as it relates to the maintenance of the Code of Ethical Conduct, the anti-fraud system, the anti-bribery and corruption framework, the ABC, all of that is at the compliance committee level. To what extent is this committee at the board level playing a proactive role in creating the appropriate systems that can actually mitigate the level of toxicity in the organization through addressing the topics that are outcomes of a toxic environment, such as bribery, corruption, conflicts of interests, insider trading, money laundering? This is where it starts. If it's messed up at this level, it will be messed up everywhere else in the organization. Don't go blame the little guy. Go up all the way up the chain. Audit committee, of course, I left it because I really believe, look, if this committee only acts as a mailbox, the auditor goes, tells them a few good stories, they like it and they leave, then we have a problem. This committee is there to challenge the auditor, to ask the auditor, have you assessed the effectiveness of our anti-bribery and corruption program? Have you assessed properly the Code of Ethical Conduct? Ask the internal auditor, he's living or she's living the day in, day out of the organization. Describe our culture for us. Is there favoritism in the organization? If we run a survey now, an anonymous survey, what will the results be? This committee needs to ask all these tough questions. They need to ask, on what basis are we remunerating people? Have you assessed the design of the remuneration systems? Have you tested the reports that are sent to the board that outline performance? Are we presenting performance that could be misleading or not attributable to the real performance of the people? But if all of these committees want to come, have a good 2-3 hours, have a few jokes, talk politics, have lunch and go, it's not going to work. That's the sad truth. Now, regarding your question, you're asking me about the role of audit. Of course, the auditor has a key role to play in presenting in his reports the anomalies that exist in the design of the processes that I have mentioned. Yani, for example, the IIA standards, they dictate that the audits governance every year. The question is, how do we audit governance? I'm answering your question right now. If you as an auditor, you're going to take your regulatory requirement and put a checklist on it and check it out and tell them you meet the checklist, you have good governance, then yes, you're not playing your role. However, if you as an auditor, you go in deeper and you focus on the areas that matter, and in a good, non-aggressive, presentable, proactive way, provide these specific recommendations that can alter the way we are executing things in the organization, that is your role, and that will make a big difference. So that's to answer your question. So ladies and gentlemen, we don't have much time left. I wish I could talk more about this topic. However, it's time that we start talking about these things that are really impacting organizations and just stop focusing on the generalities of things that are impacting us. Because clearly, if we see the way the world is going, it's getting worse in organizations many times, it's not getting better. So thank you for your time. I welcome your questions and your thoughts and your comments as well. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Muhammad. Very interesting. I had a question myself, but I will leave it till the end. So, ladies and gentlemen, time for you to ask Muhammad your question.
شكرا. ممكن والله
تفضل.
لسه والله موضوع جدا مهم ويمكن ما حدا منتبه له. Thank you very much, Mr. Muhammad, for this presentation. By the way, what is the meaning of this toxic leader in Arabic?
أول شيء اسم الكريم مين معي؟
محمد بهجة.
محمد بهجة، أهلا وسهلا فيك. والله بالعربي خليني أفكر لك فيها.
سام مسموم أو سام
التنفيذي.
قائد مسموم.
قائد مسموم. إذا بدك قائد مضروب.
اوكي هو توكسيك يعني سم بسمم هيك؟
ايه توكسيك سام
المؤذي الضار المفسد.
هيك السم انا اقول سام اخطر يعني عم ببث سموم.
هذه حقيقة موجودة معظم المؤسسات والشركات. شكرا جزيلا على الموضوع. شكرا.
اهلا وسهلا فيك حبيبي. ثانك يو.
Other question? Muhammad, there is a question from Yusuf Yassin. Can you see it on the chat?
Yes, I saw it. So I already answered this question regarding what is the role of IA. I said when we audit governance, we need to spot out the discrepancies in the design and in the implementation of the key controls that can actually mitigate toxicity in the organization. When you're assessing the role of the committees, the KPI framework, the remuneration systems, the org structure, and all the conflicts of interest, segregation of duties, all of those that I talked about. Regarding Yahya's question, what if the head audit was the toxic one? I said, I already talked about that. I said there are, by the way, Yahya, 2 years ago, just so you guys don't think that I'm only focusing on the management. 2 years ago, I did a presentation like this in one of the IIA conferences in the UAE. It's available on my YouTube page. And it was called The Toxic Chief Audit Executive. So I've already done a piece on the toxic auditor. You can go and check it, and then we can talk. Okay, Mahmoud, I believe this needs a culture change, and this can be done only on a top-down approach to be effective. Yet if the top leadership is toxic, what is the solution? Well, look, as I said, it starts with the board. Yeah, as an auditor, you need to influence that board to a large extent. And the solution is that you need to keep on recommending changes in processes. My advice to you, if you're asking me what do I do if I am in a fight with a toxic leader, my opinion to you, don't play their game. A toxic leader would love to get you on the field. Stay out of the field. Fight your fight in a different field. Bring him to yours. Don't let him bring him to his or hers. So that's my advice to you in that regard. Any other questions? Eli, tell me.
Yes, let me ask my question. You said in your presentation, Muhammad, that a toxic leader lives in a toxic environment. Let me flip the question. May we have a toxic culture without pinpointing a specific one toxic leader?
Hello. So what you're saying is that the environment wasn't created by one person, but it's created by the entire company.
I join a company and I discovered quickly that the environment, the culture is toxic. But I cannot blame it to one person. It's just the way things are.
Yes. Okay, fine. So first, yes, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, Eli, there's no such thing as a toxic leader in an untoxic environment. So there are enablers that give an environment that can help this person grow. So in a good environment, this toxic leader cannot survive. So definitely, when we have a successful toxic leader, you need to understand that the community around him, to a large extent, is there and is supporting it. Now that can vary.
Yeah, but that could leave, and we still have a toxic culture.
Exactly. That's the point I was getting to. But sometimes when the culture is all toxic, the person that newly joins plays the game. This is the way it is. Well, okay, let us play along. And it becomes ومعك حق ليه بتصير contagious. And I really believe, and I agree with you, and this is where I believe auditors play a vital role in trying to influence that environment.
इन्होंने मुझे उसके बारे में कुछ ऐसी बातें बताई तो मैं चाहता था कि ये हम लोग करें आगे.
But I see someone having a question on the chat box. Cesar, don't you think one of the ways to detect toxic leaders is by continually screening on existing staff instead of just obtaining a background check upon hiring? I don't think I understand the question. I don't support doing like surveillance on people. This is not something I would support, but I would definitely agree with you that background checks are essential. You know, if you go, by the way, Cesar, go to the COSO frame, the ARM frame, COSO framework. First component in the COSO frame, governance and culture. Principle 5 in COSO ARM, it tells you hiring competent, ethical people. So the hiring process, especially at the leadership level, and this is why I said the nomination committee plays a critical role in establishing systems that can nominate people that have the ethical prerequisites that are required to be in the leadership position. Now, Eli, you're saying, I think this is a problem in family businesses. I don't agree with you. I wouldn't like to frame family businesses like that. I've seen very successful, well-governed family businesses. And I've also seen very badly and poorly governed family businesses. And I have seen corporates that are disastrous, and I have seen corporates that are very good. So I wouldn't frame it or say this type of organization will have this more than that. And regarding Eli Abdel-Sattar, yes, I agree, it's a matter of culture. Any other questions or comments? People might be afraid of getting fired. Look, I cannot speak for other people. I don't know. Each person has their own situation. But I can tell you this, okay? Your income, the illusion that your income is based on one person or one company is an illusion, okay? There are always opportunities for you to seek. I would not, this is a personal opinion, not a professional one. I wouldn't advise anyone to stay in a toxic environment and justifying it that I need the income, because believe me, the impact it will have on your mental health is so severe that you will never find any other job again anyway. So this is what I can advise you in that regard.
I agree with you, Muhammad, but let me just put my personal comment. تعرفوا النكتة I have a family. عندي عائلة. عندي عائلة. And actually one of the former politicians in Lebanon used it once. I have a family. So أوقات ideally I agree with you. Practically people have bills to pay. Anyway.
I understand. بس إلي بنفس الوقت اللي عم حاول أقوله إنه أنت عم تخسر حالك. So you have to balance it out to see what's right for you. أنا آخر سؤال ما حجاوب عليه لأنه I don't know what's the basis of that. So I will not answer that question. Any other question?
So if you don't have any more questions, I would like to thank Muhammad one more time for his presentation. Very interesting. By the way, now on the chat, our colleague Omar Sayed is going to share with us the link for the evaluation. It's only 5 questions per speaker.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Best of luck, everyone. Stay in touch. I'm so happy I engaged you again.
Thank you, Muhammad, and see you all tomorrow. Yeah, this is it. Please do not leave before you press the button, as I'm trying to do now, and filling the evaluation. Thank you.
Les bailleurs de fonds
Thank you, Muhammad.
Thank you. أهلا وسهلا.
Much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Habib. Thank you, Eli. Best
Ladies and gentlemen, make sure you fill the evaluation form. We need it to better prepare future conferences and events.